Welcome back to another classic album review, and I know what you're kind of thinking on this one. Is Invisible Touch a classic album? I wanted to do it. I consider it a classic. I do. I don't consider it one of, Genesis's best albums, but in terms of a band who went pop, kind of made their start by going prog, I honestly think this is really good. And I'm going to get into it properly in the actual album review. But I also realize, this is one of the last albums from Genesis that I have talked about. I think it's this and We Can't Dance are the last two. And I guess Genesis to Revolutions, or Revelations. But I don't know if I actually want to do that one. I don't know what I'm going to talk about. It's Brit pop from the 1960s. It's fine. I don't really have too much to talk about. It's fine. It's fine. So maybe eventually I'll come around to do We Can't Dance, but I consider Invisible Touch more of a classic than We Can't Dance for reasons that I'm going to get into right about now. So let's dive in. Invisible Touch by Genesis. So Genesis, classic progressive rock band from the 70s that went pop in the 80s for quite a bit of success, I will have to say. If you can believe it, this is their, 13th full-length album? 5, 10, 11, 12, 13th studio album, released in 1986. So, coming in right in the smack dab in the middle of the 80s, coming back really with some of the most recognized and well-known Genesis tracks, in my opinion. One of the things that really sets this album apart from any of the other ones, outside of maybe Duke, is how well it's able to balance the pop, accessible, catchy, fun times with the prog, experimental, pushing of boundaries aspects. And I feel like every album from the 80s of Genesis tried to do this to varying degrees of success. Abacab tried it with experimental pop that, in my opinion, failed. And Genesis, their self-titled, or Shapes, depending on how you want to, classify it, was a little darker and had some of the best prog stuff that they've done in the 80s, but really fell flat in terms of the pop side of things. Like All That and Illegal Alien are, Illegal Alien is a massive stinker. In that respects, balancing the pop and the prog, only Duke and Invisible Touch, I feel, were successful. I would say Duke is much more successful on being a prog album, and Invisible Touch is much more successful on being a pop album. So that's kind of where I draw the line and how the two are a little bit different. In terms of the pop side of things, I really do love Invisible Touch, the actual title track of this album. It's fun. It's catchy. It's got this really fun groove on it. It's accessible. It's immediately infectious. I find myself bopping and singing along to it. It's the kind of pop music that I really, really enjoy. The same can be said about Land of Confusion. And if you actually get down to the lyrics of it, Land of Confusion is a pretty dark track, especially when you come into today's context. This album or this track is almost 40 years old, in another couple of years, it's going to be 40 years old. And a lot of the things that they're talking about, oh boy, as well as, the final track of the Brazilian, which is one of the last, if not the last purely instrumental track that the band has done. And I love the Brazilian. It is such a powerhouse of a track. And when they played this live on the Wembley Stadium DVD, it's just so moving. I can't believe more people don't love this track and don't point to this track as being a really burning light on this. And then finally, the song that I skipped over, Domino, which really is the big prog track off of this. Much like Second Home by the Sea, or I guess even Home by the Sea, they're still showing that they can be prog. To say that Genesis really scrubbed off all the prog side of things would be giving this track a massive disservice, because this track is a modern prog track. You know, I love the build up, I love the play out, I love that big crescendo and the instrumental piece that we have on there. They're experimenting with sounds and styles on there, and not relying on the drum machine that they did on past albums, you know, but really rooting them down. And man, Phil's vocals on that track, it's piercing, it's infectious, it gets right into your hearts. Now let's talk about some of the tracks that I am less than excited for. And those are the rest of the tracks. The second track of Tonight, Tonight, Tonight. The fourth track of In Too Deep. The follow-up of Anything She Does. It's the fifth track. And the seventh track of Throwing It All Away. Honestly, I'm not as big of a fan of all of these tracks. They're more ballady. They're a little bit more slow. They're much more of the heart ballad track that I'm not a big fan of, that I always felt like Genesis never really captured all that well. You know, they always struggled for the heart ballad, and I just never really felt all that invested in any of these tracks. They weren't like grating on me. I didn't run to turn off the radio at any point on any of these tracks. Throwing It All Away is probably my favorite of these because it's a little bit more on the shorter side, and I'm a little bit more invested in it. But man, Tonight, Tonight, Tonight at almost 9 minutes, just come on, guys, get to the point. Like, even me who loves progressive rock, I'm like, I think we could summarize this a little bit quicker. In Too Deep is a fun romp, as well as Anything She Does is a little bit more fun. But it's these tracks that I can understand why people don't return to this album. But for me, it's The Invisible Touch, it's Land of Confusion, it's Domino, and it's The Brazilian. Like, these 4 tracks take up half of the album. So I don't want to discredit the entire album as a whole because of those other 4 tracks that are less than stellar. You know, it's not like Abacab where there's maybe 1 track on there that I'll return to. And it's also not like the self-titled work where there's really only 3 tracks of 8 that I want to return to over and over again. This one, at least over half of the album, is one that I want to return to and listen to. So yeah, so that's what I've got for Invisible Touch. Is it their worst album? No. Is it their best album? No, but it's a fun album and one that I love returning to, if only for Domino and The Brazilian. But even Invisible Touch and Land of Confusion are fun enough that will make me want to come back for more. I will say, if more prog bands that went pop created songs that were like Invisible Touch and like Land of Confusion, I would be a-okay with a lot of those bands going more pop in the 80s. Unfortunately, what we ended up getting were a lot of those bands that just created run-of-the-mill stadium rock that I was very lackluster over. You know, I was very like, this is just a snooze fest. There's nothing in these tracks. So, yeah, that's what I've got for Invisible Touch. I think this album deserves a little bit more credit than it actually gets. But this album also sold a hell of a lot of records. You know, I think this was their most successful album. And, you know, trying to say, oh, people need to really appreciate this album more when it sold the most amount of copies of their entire discography. Yeah. I just wish that those prog snobs wouldn't just, you know, shit all over this album because it was successful. You know, so that's what I've got for Invisible Touch. If you haven't listened to it lately, I highly recommend checking it out. As I mentioned, just for Domino and The Brazilian alone, that 15 minutes worth of music is well worth your time. It's one that you shouldn't just throw away from the wayside and never listen to it again. You know, it's fun music. And that's what I've got. That's what I've got for you guys today. Go and listen to Invisible Touch from Genesis. It's a bop. It's a banger. I recommend it. And yeah, what did you guys think about Invisible Touch? Do you love it? Do you hate it? I've heard both sides. Where do you fall on that? Or are you somewhere in the middle? You're like, it's fine. Whatever. Let me know all about that by commenting down below. And thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.